So let's start with consumer surplus. And we'll begin by thinking about willingness to pay. So willingness to pay, that's how we're going to start thinking about, our demand curve. Is what's the maximum someone would be willing to pay for this good or for this service? And imagine we have this market for tutoring. And we have different buyers of tutoring. Let's say there's 3 people in this market. Let's kind of ignore that we need many, and let's just think about 3 for simplicity right now. And let's imagine there's 3 people. And so we have Maddie, Tianyi, and Mikhail. And we're thinking about what their willingness to pay for an hour of tutoring is. Willingness to pay. And let's imagine that Maddie is willing to pay, let's say, $30 an hour. For tutoring, Tianyi is only willing to pay $20 an hour for tutoring. Well, Mikhail, he's only willing to pay $15 an hour for tutoring. So what the consumer surplus is going to be the difference between their willingness to pay and the actual price of the good or service in the market. Consumer surplus. It's supposed to be an S there, sorry. Consumer surplus is going to be the difference between willingness to pay and the price of the good. So for example, let's say price equals, let's make it $21 an hour. That's the going rate for tutoring, let's say, on campus or online or whatever. And so at this price of $21, we know that, well, that's more than Mikhail's willing to pay, so he's not going to get any tutoring. That's more than Tianyi's willing to pay, so they're not going to get any tutoring. And only Maddie is going to get tutoring services or buying some tutoring. So only they are the ones that are willing to pay more than $21 or $21 or above. And so the consumer surplus, I'll just put CS for Maddie, equals 30, because that's their willingness to pay, minus 21. So $9 is their willingness to pay. Now let's say another example would be the price is lower. Let's say the price equals $18 an hour. Well, at that, both Tianyi and Maddie are both willing to buy tutoring, get tutoring, and the consumer surplus for Maddie has now gone up. Used to be $9 at this price of $21. Well, now just getting $12 of consumer surplus. And Tianyi, they're willing to pay 20, they pay 18. So they have $2 in this consumer surplus. And so now we can start to think about this graphically. So we can start to think about willingness to pay as the height of the demand curve. And so now we have 3 people, so it's going to be kind of a weird shaped demand curve, but let's draw it out and think about consumer surplus graphically. We'll start with the price of 21 and then kind of talk about what happens graphically as we move the price down to 18. So let's draw out the demand curve for these three individuals, for Maddie, Tianyi, and Mikhail. Remember, this is the market for tutoring, and they're trying to purchase some tutoring. It's the quantity of tutoring. This is the price, let's say in dollars of tutoring. And so we have three people. So the demand curve is going to look kind of weird here because we have three people as opposed to many. But let's start with this simple example and kind of think about, to illustrate kind of this idea, this concept of consumer surplus. Then we can think about what it looks like with many people. And the demand curve will start looking like kind of the normal kind of downward sloping without kind of kinks in it. All right, so Maddie was willing to pay $30 for tutoring. So let's start there. And so this is Maddie, that's her willingness to pay. Remember that $20 was what Tianyi was willing to pay. So the price of $20, two people are willing to purchase tutoring. And then remember at $15, we had Mikhail that was willing to purchase that. So this is what our demand curve looks like here in this market for tutoring with just three people. So it has this kind of weird step shape because there's only three people and we're kind of separating the people here. All right, so let's think about this consumer surplus graphically. And so remember we had the first one was a price, if I remember, was $21. And so at $21, that's just above what Tianyi was willing to pay. And so this was the consumer surplus. So this area here is the consumer surplus. And so if we want to think about calculating that area, you could think of it's the area of a rectangle, right? It's a 1 by 9, so 1 times 9 is $9 or 9. Just like we got before. We're just thinking about it graphically now. And we said, what happens if the price goes down to 18? So if the price went down, let's try to get another color that might show up here. So let's try blue. I think we set a price of 18. So let's say that's about there. And so notice now that there's two people buying it, and the additional consumer surplus is that blue area there. So this area plus this area is the consumer surplus. And so we see that as the price goes down, the consumer surplus is increasing. And it's increasing because of two reasons, right? The first thing is people who are already buying in the market. So for instance, this was the willingness to pay for Maddie. So someone who is already purchasing the good now gets more consumer surplus for themselves if the price goes down. So they're getting this kind of additional area right here. But consumer surplus is also going up because more consumers are entering the market. So this was the consumer surplus for Tianyi right here, which is the difference between what they're willing to pay and what they actually pay. So this little area, remember, was $2. Or sorry, what was it? $2 exactly, yeah, at a price of 18. And so this is what it looks like graphically. So it's below the below the demand curve, above the price. So if we start to think about this more generally and have our normal demand curve, so let's draw another market over here, price and quantity, and let's say we have this nice straight demand curve with many buyers as opposed to this kind of stepwise one. And now what's happening is that, let's say the price was P0, this whole area is going to be the consumer surplus. Below the demand curve, above the price. We're just kind of taking the idea here and, maybe kind of helps us understand what these areas are kind of capturing, and then we're moving on to this demand curve that we're more familiar with. So again, think of this demand curve as the willingness to pay. And so what the consumer surplus is everything below the demand curve and above the price. So you can think about, there being like an infinitely number of people along this demand curve, I guess, but we're taking the difference between everyone's willingness to pay and the price they actually pay. And again, if the price goes down, we see that consumer surplus is going to increase. And it's going to increase for a couple reasons, right? Just like we said over there. It's going to increase by this area as well as this area. So as the price goes down, the people who are already in the market, so all these people up to here were already purchasing the product, now they're getting a lower price, so they're paying a lower price, and so they're increasing their consumer surplus. But we also have this other little area here where now new buyers are entering the market because the price is lower. So consumer surplus is going up for two reasons. Just like over here. When the price gets lower, it goes up because new people enter the market, as well as the people who are already buying are better off, or they have a greater consumer surplus. And we can think of the reverse happening as the price goes up too. People are leaving the market, which lowers consumer surplus, and the people that are still willing to buy the good are getting a smaller consumer surplus each, which means a smaller consumer surplus overall. So that's what consumer surplus looks like graphically.